So we're in chapter 6 of Romans, the second part now, and remember, this is all about life in the kingdom, which may be said in another way, what the people of God, the covenant people of God, what privileges they have. And the privilege is freedom from the sin kingdom of Adam, freedom from the guilt, the condemnation, the abandonment, the shame, all that goes on in the kingdom of Adam. We are freed from that. We've been transferred into Christ's kingdom where life exists instead of death and sin. And now, how do we live in this kingdom? Paul has said, we died to sin. Not in the sense that we don't feel it anymore or fail in it, but that we died to the sin kingdom of Adam. And now we are slaves. Oh, but boy, that doesn't sound very good news, does it? Well, let's take a look at it. Colin Cook here, and how it happens. Thank you for joining me today. What are you listening to? A broadcast on good news. The good news of the kingdom, the good news of our Father who loves us with a generous, compassionate heart, and who has sent his Son, and the Son has been more than willing to go to this earth in order to live for us, live in our place, do what we failed to do, and to perish for our own broken humanity and the whole sin kingdom of Adam, and to rise again for the new kingdom that we live in now and we shall receive when Jesus returns. It's an enormously wonderful message. It's good news. We need good news every day, you know that. And as we receive this good news and trust in God, trust in Jesus, now we know the heart of God, we have courage to break into our addictive struggles by faith. We are training our faith. We're learning to say, no, there's something better than this. And we move on gradually, or maybe immediately. So then, verse 15, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? Now you remember last week I mentioned I explained why Paul asks this question. He has said in chapter 5, let's see, where is it? Verse 20, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. Not the law entered so that the offense might be curtailed, or so that the law might put the brakes on sin. Rather, the law entered that it might abound. In other words, as he reveals the law, we become more and more aware of our sins. Not only do we become more aware of them, the law actually, in its relationship to our broken human nature, stimulates sin. That comes out in chapter 7, and we'll see that a bit later. But then Paul says, but where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. Because God came in with his mercy, God came in with forgiveness, God came in, you remember, with all of those ceremonial sacrifices which were illustrative of the death of Jesus Christ, when we're faced with all of this law that we have failed to keep. And so this is why he says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law? You see, Paul has stated we died to the law. Sin shall not have any dominion over us, verse 14, for you are not under the law, but under grace. You remember I talked about that last week. It's a strange verse at first, because you see, you'd think Paul would say, for sin shall not have dominion over you because you are not under sin, the dominion of sin. But he doesn't say that. He says you are not under the law. Now that seems to be rather odd until you know the relationship of law to sin and sin to law. And Paul will explain that much more in chapter 7. But just to say right now that when a person is faced with the law, both outwardly and inwardly, He is faced with guilt, and he is faced with the fear of God's judgment, and he is faced with shame, faced with the fear of abandonment. And all of that stimulates, believe it or not, sin, because we feel we have no comfort to go to in God, and therefore we find the only alternative, comfort in more sin. But you see, Paul has said, sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law but under grace. When you're under grace, sin does not have a judgment. Sin does not accuse you and say, you're no good, you won't make it, God's mad with you, and he has abandoned you. None of that takes place when we know by faith that we are under grace. Doesn't mean we become irresponsible in regard to sin, but it means that we do not let it torment us and stimulate more sinning. But now he says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? And he says, God forbid. Now, first of all, let's remember the two meanings of sin that are beginning to emerge here in Romans chapter 6. Sin, first of all, in the sense of being in the sin kingdom of Adam, where judgment reigns, condemnation reigns, guilt reigns, and abandonment reigns. We're not under that anymore. But then there's also the issue of sin in our lives. And Paul is talking about sin here not as an act simply, but as a power that reigns over us. Remember what he said in chapter 6, verse 14. Sin shall not have dominion. How fascinating he should use the word dominion. You see, we may take this as very biblical language. Oh, this is how they used to talk in those days. Not at all. Paul has an idea in his mind when he uses the word dominion. And what idea is it? Well, the word dominion is connected with domain, with a kingdom and a king. And so you see, sin is not, as I said last week twice, and I'll say it again so you can get it into your mind, sin is not simply something you do. It is something that does you. It does you in. It has a power. It's not something that we choose simply, and we are free to take it or leave it. No. We're under its dominion. This is important to understand in regard to people struggling with addiction. You know very well that the addiction that you have, whether it's drugs or alcohol or food issues or gambling or sex issues, the addiction you have rules you. You don't rule it. That's one of the delusions that addiction tries to convey to you, that you can take it or leave it any day. Well, I'll have it now, but I won't have it tomorrow. But no, the fact is it reigns. And how are we going to deal with that? Just keep denying it and keep trying to overcome it and keep going to meetings and keep repenting? No, the first thing we do, according to Romans chapter 6, is that we recognize that dominion has ended, even though our behavior may not have stopped or changed yet. We must keep affirming in our minds, by faith, that the dominion of sin has ended. And remember what that implies, primarily, that the dominion of sin is the dominion of guilt and shame and condemnation and bondage and being under a slave master that is evil and that is constantly cajoling us and telling us we're lost and we're doomed and there's no hope for you, etc. All of that now is over. Sin shall not have dominion over you. So let us start at the right place, not changing our behavior first, but changing our mind, our mindset. If you fall, you don't say, here I go again, I'm doomed, I'm back in the old habit. No, you say, Father, I thank you that though I sinned and I confess it and I ask you to forgive me, I praise you that the power of this thing is broken, that I am not under its dominion. You keep affirming that. It may seem that you're just playing games with your brain, your mind, but you're not. You're telling the truth, and the truth will gradually dawn in your mind. So what shall we say then, Paul says? Shall we sin, that is, continue to live in the sin kingdom of Adam, and also continue to be under its bondage, those two ideas, because we are not under law but under grace? And he says, God forbid. Now this is the next verse, verse 16. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves, whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death, or of obedience leading to righteousness? Now here's Paul going on being odd again. I mean, sometimes you wish Paul would straighten up and talk modern English or modern language. Yeah, but of course he was back there in ancient times. But even then his language would have been strange to the people that he was talking to. You see, first of all, he says, do you not know that to whom you present yourselves? That's interesting, isn't it? Present yourself? Have you ever thought of a sin issue as not an act, but a presenting yourself to someone, an introduction? Here I am, I'm at your service. Oh boy, that's quite a thought, isn't it, when you think of it, that when we sin, we are not simply doing an act, we are presenting ourselves to an authority. Well, of course, which authority is he talking about? Well, he's talking about the authority of Satan, the authority of evil. But you see, that's the irony. The authority of Satan has already been overthrown. That's a major teaching in this chapter. We don't have to present ourselves anymore to that being. He has been trounced. Jesus has his foot on Satan's neck, as Luther used to say. And the more we know that, the more we can say, I don't have to follow you. It's now the 17th of the month, and the radio check will be drawn on any day now by the head offices at Crawford. That will be between now, the 17th, and the 20th. The radio check is $836, and if you would like to help pay for the radio rent this week, today, put a check in the mail, would you? And send it to FaithQuest, P.O. Box 366, Littleton, Colorado 80160. That's FaithQuest, P.O. Box 366, Littleton, Colorado 80160. These donations, by the way, are tax deductible. I'll send you a receipt at the beginning of next year for all of your donations of this year, and a thank you as well. And remember, this broadcast is in its 18th year. And it is in its 18th year because of you. There's no big Christian corporation behind this radio broadcast. There is you. You, the appreciative listener, the listener whose faith is being trained and who wants other people to hear this same message of the gospel from the book of Romans. So, how about it? Would you like to be a supporter of the broadcast? If so, send your first donation to FaithQuest, P.O. Box 366, Littleton, Colorado 80160. You can send them monthly if you like, or just occasionally. Thank you so very much. I'll see you next time. Cheerio and God bless.